Assalamu alaikum. This will be a recording, one of a few that I will release before I leave my account. The reason why I'm doing it now and I haven't done it before is because I never wanted to use my account to draw attention to me, the person, and my persona. I wanted to draw attention to the topics I spoke about. And because I'm deleting my account, this won't form as part of my legacy, so to speak. So I'm going to launch straight into the topic, which is sexual harassment in virtual spaces. And this is brought on by the recent incident. I won't detail it too much, simply because I want any woman who's listening to this to be able to abstract it to a scenario or a situation she might be experiencing, or she has experienced it, and she's been spiritually and collectively manipulated by either her community or the discourse around these kind of incidents. Now, I've noticed that quite a few people prefer to refer to this as vulgarity, and the reason why I'm choosing to highlight that this is not vulgarity is because sexual harassment has very significant connotations, and these connotations are criminal. They are criminal even in Islam, unlike the prevalent view of many. Now, I want to address why vulgarity doesn't apply here, because I've noticed quite a few people summoning scripture and using that scripture to justify sexual harassment. There's been 2 hadiths up, and I won't detail them because I think everybody's seen them. One of them refers to a poet, radiallahu anh, who was allowed to make particular insinuations on the battlefield. And another one refers to Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. And I want to highlight that the disrespect here is to associate those names with sexual harassment, to use them as a shield to perpetuate what is a crime even in Islam. And not even in Islam, especially in Islam. And these men know this. They know this because they do not stop speaking about ghira and protective jealousy. A protective jealousy that they believe applies to the women close or intimate with them. Now, the reason why I chose to interrogate this is because vulgarity causes offense. Vulgarity can be one instance. It can certainly be sexual, but it isn't necessarily so. Sexual harassment is a sustained series of events, which is what we saw. If somebody writes thread after thread after thread detailing particular intimate scenarios about a woman who isn't related to a man that this person is debating, that is sexual harassment. What you do when you post a picture of a woman with these intimate scenarios and intimate details is you give tacit permission to thousands, because this person has thousands of followers, thousands of men to then sexually harass those women. And when you place the picture, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, you are aiding the visualization. It is not a coincidence. So to see a lot of people discuss this in terms of vulgarity, in my opinion, is quite disappointing, because it places the victimhood on the person who has read these words. And yes, it's true, no woman or man should be subject to those posts, but it isn't just about performative piety. It isn't just about the aesthetic of modesty or the experience of modesty. It certainly is about protecting women from this kind of discourse and decoupling Islam, the Prophet and the Sahaba from these scenarios. And it is the most violent transgression to then dig up scripture in order to justify this and reduce the topic to one of vulgarity. When you reduce the topic to one of vulgarity, you can justify vulgarity. There is no incidents in Islam that justifies sexual harassment. There is nothing in scripture that allows a man to take an innocent woman and speculate publicly on what she does or doesn't do. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. I need to emphasize that this is a form of perversion. And What happened when quite a few of us brought this up is we were told that the advice wasn't polite enough, that if we were sincere about nasiha, we would do it privately. And I want to question this. I want to question why a woman should resort to advice when she experiences or sees or spectates on sexual harassment. A man who participates in sexual harassment does not deserve advice. What he deserves is rage. What he deserves is outcry. What he deserves is social accountability. And just because men have normalized, or some men have normalized, a specific type of sexual harassment, it doesn't mean that their rage is righteous. It means it's self-righteous. The rage of a woman who asks these men to rein in their sexuality and rein in their harassment is a righteous rage. There is nothing, absolutely nothing masculine about going for someone's ex-wife and speculating on her intimate life the way that he did. And there are definitely parallels in every non-Muslim and Muslim woman's life where a man who felt aggrieved by a woman or aggrieved by a woman's a male relation related to this woman chose to use her dignity as an instrument to degrade the men in her proximity and her. And women are not tangent to humanity. We are not tangent to the Muslim community. We form half of it. We are not going to negotiate our humanity. You do not give us our dignity. Our dignity is God-given. It's our right. So our concerns with regard to our dignity and keeping our sexuality private in public spaces, even in private spaces, are not discretionary. They are obligatory. And when you transgress in the way that many men do, you will be held accountable. And no, you will not be afforded private, sweet, soft nasiha. And I've noticed that quite a lot of men who perpetuate or purport to be masculine and strong and, harsh cannot handle the accountability that comes with taking up that amount of space. If you are masculine and harsh in the way the Prophet and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum were, you would understand that your actions have consequences and you cannot be shielded by giving private nasiha. That's number one. Number two, don't insult the Prophet and his companions by using them as a medium for sexual harassment. And don't assume that this isn't a form of meninism or misogyny. Do not pretend that this is part of our tradition. Do not pretend that this is just the way of the Salaf. This is an innovation, and this is something you are trying to introduce in virtual spaces to make excuses for an underlying perversity. This is an innovation, and this should be interrogated. And it's not sufficient to just hand wave it and say, yes, it happened, we've moved past it. Now, we haven't moved past it. This hadith will be used in the future multiple times to justify what is clearly sexual harassment and obsessive behavior. Now, I'm going to, from the get-go, dismiss any conversation about the man said this, he said that, his debater said this, and okay, confine all of your insults to each other. Do not involve other people's ex-wives. Do not involve women who don't have anything to do with it. Notice how all of my critique was constrained to a single woman, and all of the discussion that has blown up surrounding this conversation is a deliberate obfuscation of that. There is no justification for what happened, and therefore there isn't a need to obscure the conversation. It definitely jump-started a conversation about feminism and, other ambiguities. What I will say to that is we were not the ones who brought up hadith to justify a crime in Islam. We were not the ones who purport to have ghira, purport to be men of integrity, men of dignity, and then debase ourselves so publicly. And there is no point engaging in this back and forth, because the incentive behind it is to dilute the conversation. And the conversation is thus: sexual harassment is wrong. The appropriate reaction to sexual harassment is outrage. Do not sexually harass women. Full stop. Do not insult the Prophet and his companions by using them as a medium for sexual harassment. Full stop. All of these points are non-negotiable. Anything else is white noise. There certainly will be a lot of gatekeeping, speculation as to whether a Muslim woman who calls out a Muslim man who is publicly sexually harassing another woman is actually Muslim. And again, because I'm addressing women, I'm going to say this: there's no point engaging with that kind of conversation, because men do not protect or guard the margins of Islam. They're not in the inside waiting to open the gates and let us in. You just have to elbow your way into the middle if you're not there already. And if people question your membership, you just have to laugh at them honestly, because your Lord is your Lord, your Deen is your Deen, and it's not really out for negotiation. You'll see that quite a few people in response to this revel at the threads that some younger vulnerable women wrote, which is, this is turning me away from the Deen. And I understand that, and I agree that it is a phenomenon, but it shouldn't be the only conversation, if only because the type of men who dabble in these things take a great ego boost from having power over your morality. So when you do say things like, I struggle with belonging into the Deen, a good tweet I can remind you of, I saw last year, a man was saying, this Deen is like a sieve, only the strongest can survive, and we need to make sure that all of the weak are sifted through. And he was saying this in the context of women and feminism, because of course, even though women are soft and fragile, they deserve harshness, and only the women who can survive a particular type of adversity are entitled to call themselves religious, and that adversity would be succumbing to a man's every whim. Now, you need to ask yourself, why do these types of men position themselves as the sieve holder? Why do they assume that you're a woman in the sieve and they are weeding out the weakness? Because they play God. They play God in these conversations, they play God in these debates, they play God in their head. And if you allow them to play God by engaging with them on their own terms, you accept the asymmetry. And the only way to engage with these conversations is to engage with someone who's equal to you, or someone who acknowledges that in front of God you are spiritually equal. And anything else is indulging a really dangerous and really egotistic pride. And we know what God said about pride. So double down, accept that you do have a position in the Deen, and when they do come up with their innovations and their scriptural manipulations, start interrogating them and asking them for accountability. You have to understand that Muslim spaces, religious spaces especially, are quite male-centric, and they're not used to hearing female voices. And so when they come online and it's mixed and it's not segregated, and they hear women voice their concerns, it comes to them as if it's feminism, and that's because they've never ever had to listen to what women have to say. So even the smallest concern to them presents itself as a vice, because they're not used to taking you into account. And if you sit there justifying whether or not you're feminist, you're obscuring the issue. If your position is sanctified in the Deen, if your position is haqq, you don't need to justify yourself. They need to justify their transgressions. And that is my advice for the young Muslim ladies of today. Wassalamu alaikum. And just as an afterthought, There will be some men who respond, and you have to understand that the type of man who responds in defense of sexual harassment is not the type of man you want to engage with. And the only way you can emasculate such a specimen is to ignore it.